Selinunte was an ancient Greek city on the southwestern coast of Sicily in Italy. It was situated between the valleys of the Belus and Modena rivers. It now lies in the comune Castelvetrano, between the frazioni of Tricina di Selinunte in the west and Maranella di Selinunte in the east. The archaeological site contains 5 temples centered on an acropolis. Of the 5 temples, only the Temple of Hera, also known as Temple E, has been re-erected. At its peak before 409 BC, the city grew to 30,000 people excluding slaves. History. Selinunte was one of the most important of the Greek colonies in Sicily, situated on the southwest coast of that island, at the mouth of the small river of the same name, and 6.5 kilometers west of that of the Hypsas. It was founded, according to the historian Thucydides, by a colony from the Sicilian city of Megara, or Megara Hyblia, under the conduct of a leader named Pamulus, about 100 years after the settlement of that city, with the addition of a fresh body of colonists from the parent city of Megara in Greece. The date of its foundation cannot be precisely fixed, as Thucydides indicates it only by reference to that of the Sicilian Megara, which is itself not accurately known, but it may be placed about 628 BCE. Diodorus places it 22 years earlier, or 650 BCE, and Hieronymus still further back, 654 BCE. The date from Thucydides, which is probably the most likely, is incompatible with this earlier epoch. The name is supposed to have been derived from quantities of wild celery that grew on the spot. For the same reason, they adopted the celery leaf as the symbol on their coins. Selinunte was the most westerly of the Greek colonies in Sicily, and for this reason was early brought into contact and collision with the Carthaginians and the native Sicilians in the west and northwest of the island. The former people, however, do not at first seem to have offered any obstacle to their progress, but as early as 580 BCE we find the Selinuntines engaged in hostilities with the people of Segistar, whose territory bordered on their own. The arrival of a body of emigrants from Rhodes and Cnidus who subsequently founded Lipara, and who lent their assistance to the Segistans, for a time secured the victory to that people, but disputes and hostilities seem to have been of frequent occurrence between the two cities, and it is probable that in 454 BCE, when Diodorus speaks of the Segistans as being at war with the Lilybians, that the Selinuntines are the people really meant. The river Mazarus, which at that time appears to have formed the boundary between the two states, was only about 25 kilometers west of Selinunte, and it is certain that at a somewhat later period the territory of Selinunte extended to its banks, and that city had a fort and emporium at its mouth on the other side. Its territory certainly extended as far as the Halicus, at the mouth of which it founded the colony of Manoa, or Heraclea, as it was afterward termed. It is evident, therefore, that Selinunte had early attained to great power and prosperity, but we have very little information as to its history. We learn, however, that, like most of the Sicilian cities, it had passed from an oligarchy to a despotism, and about 510 BCE was subject to a despot named Pythagoras, from whom the citizens were freed by the assistance of the Spartan Aurelian, one of the companions of Dorias. The causes leading the Selinuntines to abandon the cause of the other Greeks, and take part with the Carthaginians during the great expedition of Hamilcar are unknown. They had even promised to send a contingent to the Carthaginian army, which, however, did not arrive till after its defeat. The Selinuntines are next mentioned in 466 BCE, as cooperating with the other free cities of Sicily in assisting the Syracusans to expel Thrasybulus, and there is every reason to suppose that they fully shared in the prosperity of the half-century that followed, a period of tranquility and opulence for most of the Greek cities in Sicily. Thucydides speaks of Selinunte just before the Athenian expedition as a powerful and wealthy city, possessing great resources for war both by land and sea, and having large stores of wealth accumulated in its temples. Diodorus also represents it at the time of the Carthaginian invasion, as having enjoyed a long period of tranquility, and possessing a numerous population. The Sicilian expedition in 416 BCE, a renewal of the old disputes between Selinunte and Segestar, became the occasion of the great Athenian expedition to Sicily. The Selinuntines were the first to call in the powerful aid of Syracuse, and thus for a time obtained the complete advantage over their enemies, whom they were able to blockade both by sea and land. But in this extremity the Segestans had recourse to the assistance of Athens. Though the Athenians do not appear to have taken any measures for the immediate relief of Segestar, it is probable that the Selinuntines and Syracusans withdrew their forces at once, as we hear no more of their operations against Segestar, nor does Selinunte bear any important part in the war of which it was the immediate occasion. Nicias indeed proposed, when the expedition first arrived in Sicily, that they should proceed at once to Selinunte and compel that city to submit on moderate terms, but, this advice being overruled, the efforts of the armament were directed against Syracuse, and the Selinuntines in consequence bore but a secondary part in the subsequent operations. They are, however, mentioned on several occasions as furnishing auxiliaries to the Syracusans, and it was at Selinunte that the large Peloponnesian force sent to the support of Gylippus landed in the spring of 413 BCE, having been driven over to the coast of Africa by a tempest. Captured by Carthage, the defeat of the Athenian armament apparently left the Segestans at the mercy of their rivals. They tried in vain to ease Selinuntine hostility by ceding without further contest the frontier district that was the original subject of dispute. The Selinuntines, however, were not satisfied with this concession, and continued to press them with fresh aggressions, leading the Segestans to seek assistance from Carthage. After some hesitation, Carthage sent a small force, with the assistance of which the Segestans defeated the Selinuntines in a battle. The Carthaginians in the following spring sent over a vast army amounting, according to the lowest estimate, to 100,000 men, with which Hannibal Mago landed at Lilybaeum, and from thence marched direct to Selinunte. The city's inhabitants had not expected such a force and were wholly unprepared to resist it. The city fortifications were, in many places, in disrepair, and the auxiliary force promised by Syracuse and Agrigentum and Gela was not ready and did not arrive in time. The Selinuntines defended themselves with the courage of despair, and, even after the walls were breached, continued the contest from house to house. However, the enemy's overwhelming numbers rendered resistance hopeless, and after a 10-day siege the city was taken and most of the defenders put to the sword. According to sources, of the citizens of Selinunte 16,000 were slain, 5,000 made prisoners, and 2,600 under the command of Empedon escaped to Agrigentum. Shortly after, Hannibal destroyed the city walls, but gave permission to the surviving inhabitants to return and occupy it as tributaries of Carthage, an arrangement confirmed by the treaty subsequently concluded between Dionysius, tyrant of Syracuse, and the Carthaginians, in 405 BCE. In the interval a considerable number of the survivors and fugitives had been brought together by Hermocrates, and established within its walls. A considerable part of the citizens of Selinunte availed themselves of this permission, and that the city continued to subsist under the Carthaginian dominion, but a fatal blow had been given to its prosperity, which it undoubtedly never recovered. Destruction. The Selinuntines are again mentioned in 397 BCE as declaring in favor of Dionysius during his war with Carthage, but both the city and territory were again given up to the Carthaginians by the peace of 383 BCE, and though Dionysius recovered possession of it by arms shortly before his death, it is probable that it soon again lapsed under the dominion of Carthage. The Halikas, which was established as the eastern boundary of the Carthaginian dominion in Sicily by the Treaty of 383 BCE, seems to have generally continued to be so recognized, notwithstanding temporary interruptions, and was again fixed as their limit by the treaty with Agathocles in 314 BCE. This last treaty expressly stipulated that Selinunte, as well as Heraclea and Himera, should continue subject to Carthage, as before. In 276 BCE, however, during the expedition of Pyrrhus to Sicily, the Selinuntines voluntarily submitted to that monarch. After the capture of Heraclea, during the First Punic War, we again find Selinunte subject to Carthage, and its territory was repeatedly the theatre of military operations between the contending powers. But before the close of the war, when the Carthaginians were beginning to contract their operations, and confine themselves to the defense of as few points as possible, they removed all the inhabitants of Selinunte to Lilybaeum and destroyed the city. It seems certain that it was never rebuilt. Pliny the Elder, indeed, mentions its name as if it still existed as a town in his time, but Strabo distinctly classes it with extinct cities. Ptolemy, though he mentions the river Selinus, has no notice of a town of the name. The Thermae Selinuntii, which derived their name from the ancient city, and seem to have been much frequented in the time of the Romans, were situated at a considerable distance, 30 kilometers, from Selinunte. They are sulphurous springs, still much valued for their medical properties, and dedicated, like most thermal waters in Sicily, to San Calogero. At a later period they were called the Aqua Labodes or Larodes, under which name they appear in the itineraries. The walls of Selinunte enclosed an area of approximately 100 hectares. The population of the city has been estimated at 14,000 to 19,000 people during the 5th century BC.